Before we begin, we would like to thank the National Science Foundation Office of Polar Programs for their financial support to ARCIS and to this seminar series. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Tobias, or Toby Schwoerer, is a research assistant professor at the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Toby's research focuses on human dimensions of sustainable systems with a focus on social ecological systems in the Arctic. Over the past 15 years, he has worked on a diverse set of public policy issues, including natural resource management, fisheries, energy, and transportation. Toby uses applied economics and community science to inform data-driven approaches to resource management in Alaska. He is grateful for over a decade of close collaboration with the Alaska Invasive Species Partnership, a network of private citizens, local, state, tribal, and federal government partners working together to prevent and manage invasive species in Alaska. Welcome, Toby. At this point, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to present to you today about a few years of recent research. I want to also acknowledge the Denana people on whose land I'm today presenting from. I'm located in Anchorage, Alaska. And also want to acknowledge really the many collaborators over the years that I've had the joy to work with. And I put them right into my author list so that I hope I didn't forget anybody, but some of you may actually be listening to this talk today. So thank you very much. I want to present also acknowledge many of these collaborators are really coming or are part of the Alaska Invasive Species Partnership. And this has been, this is actually just a new brand name for an older, a longer running organization that really includes many partners that have just been mentioned in the introduction. And their main focus, their slogan is really keep Alaska wild and free. And it's a wonderful group of people that have over the years really contributed to this research. Their mission is to prevent and reduce impacts of invasive species on Alaska, exchange knowledge, raise awareness, and also inform management decisions. And this is really where my talk will be centering. It's closely aligned with the Arctic Council's Arctic Invasive Alien Species areas plan priorities, and those are urgent and effective action, which kind of says it right up front. It's a growing problem, and it's certainly persistent, and urgent action is needed. Also focusing on knowledge exchange from all sides, including traditional ecological knowledge and from all communities across the Arctic to really inform decisions on the management level, and focusing very importantly on prevention, early detection, and rapid response. Just to give you a little overview, I'm focusing today, or I'm presenting on two, give you a little background on that Arctic invasion front and why it is a growing and persistent problem, and then give you some examples of where community science really contributed to some of the management priorities and management actions that have been taken so far, and focusing there on aquatic invasive species. And aquatic invasive species are an interesting example because they're a real tough management challenge. They're hidden below the surface. They're not easily detected, obviously. They're in the water. We don't see them necessarily. And they are very expensive to manage once they are established. One example is obviously Elodia, which is also called Canadian waterweed. It's Alaska's first aquatic invasive species. It's been really brought to our awareness or found in 2010 when we really got aware of it. And over the years have become like the main aquatic invasive species we have been dealing with in Alaska. And then also give you a second example, which is a good example when it comes to prevention. It's related to Dreisnet mussels. These are the quagga and zebra mussels. Many of you maybe know about the problem in the lower 48 as they got introduced into the Great Lakes through ballast water that came from ships, and basically wandered across, or got introduced across the United States, into the Western United States, and now pushing up into more northern latitudes. And so this is a perfect example of a prevention scenario that I want to lay out to you, and then come up with some of the solutions. What are the lessons learned from these two examples? And just upfront, I'm coming from an applied economics perspective, and I focus on primarily the social aspects of a social ecological system in this case, how I target the problem of aquatic invasive species. And that, as I may lay out to you, is somewhat I hope contributes in that sense to the management and improving management of our systems, social ecological systems in the north, in aiming on improving the conservation of what we have and the sustainability of our natural resources. And let's remind us, Alaskans, as Alaskans, we often have to remind us that we are living in a very unique ecosystem, if we were looking at it from a global perspective. I'm coming from Germany, where most of our ecosystems have already been altered, very much so as similar to the lower 48, as we call them, ecosystems, or say, 3/4 of all ecosystems across the globe have been altered by humans to the point where we no longer can say they're pristine, or they're no longer functioning with their all ecosystem functionality. And so in Alaska, we do live in those ecosystems still, and we have a responsibility to really manage them in a way to retain that unique value. That's where management of aquatic invasive species, I think, as I will show you, has a unique role to play. Looking at the historical records in our herbariums and putting together kind of an invasion timeline over the years, I've looked into the Alaska Exotic Plants Information Clearinghouse, also we call AK EPIC. And this database is really a neat, has a neat visualization tool that you can go online to. And it shows you how, starting in the 1960s, what we've collected from the records from the previous records, and then in the 1990s, obviously surveillance efforts really started to pick up. But we could establish kind of a historical record, and you can see in these slides that here's the invasion front going into the Arctic. You can see in the more red hexagons here, these are the more intense or higher numbers or frequencies of observations, occurrences of invasive species. And up to this point, we have over more than 300 terrestrial invasive species that have been recorded and documented in Alaska. And this obviously compares to the United States, which has a much larger number of invasive species, over 6,000 that have been documented. And so this also shows you that we are at that invasion front that's moving up north with climate changing and obviously human-induced pathways. And so of those, there are 19 highly invasive species that we currently know of in Alaska, and you can see it again. They are more concentrated in those population centers around Anchorage, where you see the red here, and then along the road system. But what I'm also taking from this slide is that they're slowly pushing into the more remote areas of Alaska. And this is also a story that I can show you some further evidence with Elodia later on. And Elodia is one of those highest invasive species that we know of. Alaska's first aquatic invasive species. It was It was first we became aware of in 2010 when we found an infestation in the Fairbanks area, and we thought it was introduced to the aquarium trade. And that made us aware that actually we had some records that Elodia showed up in this area near Cordova in Eyak Lake in the 1980s, and has there since now spread into other more remote lakes through floatplane traffic and other human-mediated transports. And the same in the Fairbanks area. It's been in the upper Tanana River Valley, more infestations. Since 2010, we really found new infestations every single year. And in 2012, it's interesting to note we found in 3 infested lakes with Elodia, which looks like you can see here. It's got these 3 leaves and this lighter green stem, and we found it in the Kenai area, and there it was for the first time we started to really hone in on potential management solutions, finding management solutions which include herbicides to eradicate these infestations in the lakes. And it's been very successful in the Kenai area, to the point that we no longer point towards an infestation on the map, but just had to put it back in our AK EPIC database. It's also been transported with floatplanes into the more remote regions, 2 lakes in the Mat-Su that are remote, and Big Lake in the Mat-Su, and then some lakes around the Anchorage area. So this really, this problem, and it started in 2010, especially with floatplanes starting to carry this invader. It gets entangled in the rudder of a floatplane. I thought we needed to find ways to really inform management and find ways to use community science, especially to fill some of the knowledge gaps that management needed to really prioritize actions across the larger landscape as the invader moved into the more remote areas. And at the same time, justify action in using economic data or economic damage estimates to justify action and really lay out the cost and benefits of management actions, which justifies budgets and other information that management agencies need. It was also obvious that the eradication in 2012, when we first eradicated these 2 lakes, we really got aware that the eradications are very expensive, over $1,000 per acre. And you can see here, this is the floatplane base in Anchorage, where we discovered Elodia in 2014. And Lake Hood in Anchorage is one of the most, if not the most, busiest floatplane base in the world, with over 700 floatplanes being parked around the lake. And it's kind of a central hub for floatplane traffic all across Alaska. And this also made it very apparent that we had to really closely work with floatplane pilots if we wanted to know more where they're flying, where they're potentially introducing, unintentionally, obviously, Elodia in the more remote areas. And here you can see this photo was taken of the rudder of the pontoon that's on a floatplane that allows the floatplane to traffic through water. This rudder comes down, and this whole assembly is very prone to entanglement of Elodia. So what better to do than ask pilots where they are flying? So we conducted a statewide survey with pilots, and this really helped us to specifically model how the pathway is evolving across the landscape, and coming up with probabilistic estimates for for our water bodies across a large landscape, and that then informs rapid response and was ideally would inform and allow us to reduce the spread across the landscape if we detect it early and manage it early. So we developed a little web survey where pilots could show us on the landscape or on the map, sorry, to note where the locations are they're flying to, how many trips a year they're approximately flying into those, and we were interested if their flying behavior would change if Elodia shows up in the landing zones of the water bodies they fly to. And this allowed us to really see, well, are they really affected by it? And they are. It showed that that it's a connected landscape through float plane flights that you can see here. 1 in 3 flights starts in an Elodia lake, and you can see that the float plane hubs are really the nodes where then obviously more remote water bodies can be accessed to from. In pink, you can see our up to this point known Elodia locations, and you can see the different flight frequencies. In the Bristol Bay area, you certainly have a lot of flight traffic related to sports fishing and other large traffic. And all across Alaska, it's a very connected landscape. This allowed us to really simulate, again, how the invasion could unvolve if we don't manage. We identified over 700 destinations, and it led us, by finding out what the characteristics of those destinations are, we could really define the risk domain of over 160,000 potential lakes that could serve as a destination across Alaska. And obviously the invasion rates or the invasion pathways across those regions is also dependent on the flight frequencies, and it varies across Alaska. So we cut Alaska into these regions on the right-hand side, so to really hone in on potential damages to our sockeye fisheries. As we were trying to make an economic case for eradication, it's always a challenge to tie it to an economic problem. If we can tie it to something like fisheries, then and can demonstrate potential damages to fisheries, we have the avoided damages, the benefits basically of an eradication action if it reduces the harm on our fisheries. And this is what we tried to demonstrate. We also could then model what I previously said called like water body specific infestation probabilities. And here on the left-hand side, you can see across those regions I just showed you, each water body has basically an estimate for the probability of introduction. Within that region, you can see how that varies across Alaska. And on the right-hand side, you can see how that's going to look when these floatplane bases are being cleaned up. Like Lake Hood, where we had Elodia, you can see that the risk of, or I'd say that the introduction, the probability of introduction is much reduced in all regions across Alaska if we start cleaning up or making sure that our floatplane bases are clean. So it shows the benefit of eradicating and keeping floatplane bases clean. The survey also allowed us to focus on how or estimate the potential recreation damages to pilots, because they were having safety issues with really dense vegetation in their starting zones. Obviously, by Elodia, that's creating very dense mats. It was being difficult for pilots to safely land and take off, and we saw that in our survey that second question where it asked how many flights do you think you still would make into this location, you just drop the mark into the map. Would you need to reduce your flights, or would you even have to stop flying into a lake because Elodia is creating too much of a hazard? And we were able to then estimate the recreation loss related to having to stop flying into those locations or having to reduce our trips, because you could only fly, let's say, in the spring when the vegetation was not as dense yet. And later in the year, you could no longer fly. So quantifying that, it ended up that half of all pilots actually stopped flying into those Elodia invaded waters, and on average, losing about $185 per flight in recreation value. And we were able to get to that estimate by taking flight frequencies into account and also operating costs for the planes. So it's just a way that economists look at potential recreation losses, and these are values that you can then include in a cost-benefit analysis that looks at, here's the benefit of eradicating, but it also costs you to eradicate these waters that you can see in the background here. This is the dense vegetation in Alexander Lake just a few years before it got actually managed. Very dense, and floatplanes having to taxi through that and take off are having challenges. Then we also needed to, again, tie this to an industry like fisheries, like sockeye salmon fisheries. And at the time when Elodia was really becoming an up and front problem, we didn't have the laboratory experiments or the natural experiments to really see how Elodia could affect salmon. So we needed to rely on a survey with salmon experts. And with salmon experts, we developed scenarios from which we then did, again, a survey with salmon experts to really show us what they think a very different vegetation in nursery lakes for salmon would, for example, affect, how it would affect sockeye salmon in this case. We focused on sockeye salmon as the highest valued salmon species in terms of quantity and price. And then we're able to, through that elicitation, we're able to come up with a probability for sockeye growth rate. Obviously, this is all very subjective, but it's a start, and it's no panacea for any really to solve or to get a parameter for a model. It's just a start to get a parameter from which you can then assess the uncertainty and start thinking about this problem. So not having the laboratory natural science experiments, we were relying on experts to quantify that. It turned out that the experts and the literature also on Elodia, which was very sparse in terms of the effects, excuse me, on salmon, the excuse me, harmful, turned out that Elodia had harmful dissolved oxygen levels due to the fact that in the fall, the Elodia would die down, and then it would affect dissolved oxygen levels, which then could affect younger salmon as they emerge. And dense vegetation is obviously also encroaching on salmon habitat, where they lay their redds and have their reproductive habitat. And it's also an example of where predators like northern pike can really flourish and have an effect on younger salmon populations, on younger age classes. So this was later, just recently, some of these results, interestingly, that we elicited through expert elicitation were actually confirmed by later salmon experiments in the Copper River Delta, and that research is still ongoing, but it leads, or it shows that the directional effects that we were looking at and including in our models were confirmed so far. So it allowed us to do a risk analysis. And when you have a risk analysis, you're basically weighing costs and benefits of your action. And it allows you to really justify the management action by showing that the benefits of your action far outweigh the costs of your action. We did this for sockeye fisheries and also combined looking at recreation and value loss to floatman pilots and also fisheries, potential fisheries losses with a kind of a market analysis, a consumer surplus analysis that you can see here on the right-hand side. And just looking at the median simulations of that over time, if we wouldn't manage Elodia at all, we would estimate it's a median damage to sockeye fisheries across Alaska of $172 million a year. That cuts about 10% of the ex-vessel value, the value that harvesters get when they deliver to the processor. It's about a quarter of that, so it's substantial. And over time, it would amount to very large economic damages if we wouldn't manage. And you can see in dark black that the management costs of the potential eradication scenarios that we would face if we wouldn't do anything in 50 or 100 years. You can also see that compared to the benefits of action or the avoided damages is much, much smaller. So this again shows you that you can communicate to policymakers by using some of these estimates and by using community science, by having the participating public really engaged in the research. You can fill these knowledge gaps to inform policymakers and inform management actions. The second example I want to make is one where we don't have an established invader yet. And this is maybe the more important one to present because it really lays out some of the, or starting to lay out the value of prevention. And here, there's no better example as taking Dreisnet mussels you can see here a beach in Wisconsin of all the dead Dreisnet mussels in the Great Lakes who've really had tremendous impacts in the lower 48 on aquatic systems. And if these pathways are being unchecked, they're currently largely unchecked, and we're trying to make the case for really prevention and putting up our defenses, so to speak. In the US, US-wide, the impact of quagga and zebra mussels is just mind-boggling, over 1.5 billion every single year, primarily here affecting hydroelectric facilities as the mussels are being encrusted in the intake of the hydro facilities and affecting power production. But not only in that, they have a tremendous ecosystem impact that if it would be if we would get quagga and zebra mussels in Alaska, they would have large impacts on our ecosystems and primarily our food resources for our salmon fisheries. And we think eventually we will be able to make that economic case again, looking into our fisheries impacts. But here I just want to focus on the pathway to show you where watercraft are coming from the lower 48 that potentially could carry quagga zebra mussels or other aquatic invasive species that are of high risk, like Asian clams or mud snails, the New Zealand mud snails. And it shows you where those species in the orange areas here, those species are both present, and they are over 70% of the watercraft that are coming to Alaska are not being inspected on their way. So this makes really the case for more inspections at our ports of entry to really reduce the risk of them being carried, aquatic invasive species being carried on these watercraft. We estimate that over between 1,000 and 2,000 watercraft are coming through the port of entry and at the Alcan, and they're being transported also obviously in the winter months, where in those months obviously you don't have as much of a risk because of the temperature being so low that the likelihood of larvae or mussel larvae surviving in any tanks is relatively low. But then in the summer months, if temperatures get warmer, that risk is certainly increasing. And in 2019 we realized that it just takes one boat. This was a sailboat that was coming through the Alcan border, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was starting to run inspections. And this boat came in, and it was encrusted in zebra mussel and quagga mussels that were determined to be dead, but it was still an eye-opener that it just takes one boat. Due to those preliminary inspections that have been starting in 2017, we knew a good amount of information of what's coming over land through the Alcan border, but we didn't really know much about the south central or southeast ports of watercraft coming in on marine cargo. And we really relied on existing data and on data and participation from, again, the public and experts. We looked at the Department of Motor Vehicles registrations to find out where those boats that are being registered in Alaska are actually coming from, and interviews with marine cargo companies and the Alaska Marine Highway System, and then boat brokers, to really get a better sense of the market for watercraft, especially used watercraft in Alaska, and then triangulate between those data sources to come up with kind of an estimate of how many boats are coming into Alaska that are used and are potentially from mussel-infested or other problematic states in the lower 48, where you have aquatic invasive species that are a high risk to Alaska. So the Department of Motor Vehicle Registration database really showed us that we have quite a number of used watercraft that came from mussel-infested regions of the lower 48. About 35% of the current stock of registered boats in Alaska are from those states. And obviously, we need to look at how we can prevent these from coming in and not being inspected, because that's kind of an unknown. We don't know where to put up our defenses to start preventing these aquatic invaders from coming in. And our analysis really showed that we estimate about 74 boats per year could end up in freshwater in Alaska that have previously been used in mussel-infested waters in the lower 48. But up to this point, we have inspections overland of watercraft that are being transported into Alaska through the Alcan Highway, and we don't have any defenses up or any inspection or watercraft decontamination stations in southeast, and neither do we in south central Alaska. So these are all open ports still. Economically, the literature supports this, that economically speaking, the most efficient way to manage invasive species is to prevent them in the first place. It's kind of an obvious thing. But it's better than any response. And our study from 2014 really showed that In terms of prevention, we're not yet doing enough. We're just spending about 11% of our total expenditures on invasive species research, monitoring, eradication, etc., all listed here on the left-hand side of the table. We're spending about 11% on prevention. This, I think, makes the case that spending more and investing really on prevention and outreach, especially related to aquatic invasive species, is a good first step. So what would a comprehensive prevention program really look like? It's based on outreach and education, more closely working with the boating public, and we're really starting to do that. But I think we need to do more, because to raise awareness is a first step to really make the Alaskan public aware of these aquatic invaders are starting to come in. We all need to pull together and work together. Researchers with the general public, with our land management agencies, and with, in our tribal, local, federal, and state government. And this is really where the Alaska Invasive Species Partnership is such an important network to make this happen. It also needs to be financially a sustainable program. And here we can go into the literature, and from the lower 48, where inspection stations and water and aquatic invasive species work and outreach has been so much more intense, we can learn from those regions and apply those lessons to Alaska. For example, in the United States, across the United States, the willingness to pay for such a program to prevent aquatic invasive species is about $10 per year. So this could be tagged onto a boat fee or any other finance mechanism to really get a sustainable way to finance prevention programs. This would, across Alaska, amount to $500,000 a year, and that would be sufficient to really put up inspection stations and decontamination stations and fund a really comprehensive prevention program, including outreach and education. And also the research shows where to locate those inspections is where those ports are. And Alaska is, again, in a very unique situation where you have just a few entry ports. And if we take care of those, it's a very effective way to handle and prevent these aquatic invasive species coming in through watercraft trade. Okay, so concluding, it's really, we're in a short window of opportunity here. It's a persistent problem, and it's a growing problem, and we all need to work together and through our networks. And the most cost-effective action, obviously, is prevention. And it also shows that the case of Elodia, our management needs to account for the human-connected landscape, really. Floatplains are a great example of how we all enjoy our most remotest areas across Alaska. And partnerships matter in that case to really work together across agencies with different jurisdictions across Alaska. We are kind of the puzzle of land management jurisdictions, and the Alaska Invasive Species Partnership is really the network that we need to work together across those agencies in a more effective manner. And again, working with the public, these examples really showed that we got to work with the public we got to have a strong community science aspect if we want to fill information gaps early and inform the early detection and rapid response when we often don't have the data, when we often don't have the land management or the resources to do big monitoring, big surveillance efforts. We rely on people on the ground who live in places and who are observing their environment on a day-to-day basis. It's just a bigger and bigger, stronger point to really fund or include community science in our science. And in a quantitative way, like I showed you with these examples, it is possible to use data from community science to really model and simulate potential outcomes that get you started in justifying your management and justifying your action with applied economic data. Show the costs and benefits to the policymakers that in the end justify action. So that concludes my talk. I would like to really honor and thank the many sponsors of this research today listed here that we still rely on, and our future research in this area. For example, we'll look at how we can better understand the processes that are, for example, related to entanglement in the floatplane rudders, to get better data on how the risk domain of entanglement of aquatic vegetation is really driven by not only floatplane rudder design, but also pilot behavior. And being able to model that, you can then obviously also include that into questions or answer questions that are related to, is it really worth to redesign the rudders, and how much would it reduce the risk of carrying Elodia into much more remote areas that are pristine and of high value. And it then gives you another tool to prevent further spread into our high value areas that are obviously, like I showed in the beginning, of global significance. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the time you spent listening to my talk, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Toby. That was a really great presentation. We are going to start the question and answer session now. And as a reminder, I just wanted to get to where, if you're joining by Zoom, please do type your questions into the chat. I see a couple that are there already, and I'll read the questions aloud. If you're joining by phone, press *9 to raise your hand, and you will need to unmute yourself by pressing *9, ask your question aloud, and then remute yourself by pressing *6. And for those that we will go ahead and ask some of the questions here. Allison Kelly asks, do you know if anyone is looking into construction equipment as vectors into rural Alaska? Anecdotally, we just found Vika Kraka and Ambler apparently introduced via construction equipment. It'd be great to see some data on this, and that's on terrestrial species.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that. I haven't really looked into construction as a vector, but I know of other people who may have, and this would be a perfect question for anybody in the Alaska Invasive Species Partnership. I could certainly forward that and get back to you.
Thank you. I had a question. I was wondering if any of the land management agencies have been receptive to your research, and if so, what is the status on rapid response?
Yeah, so I've been really closely working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on both of these examples, and especially on the Elodia project, where we were able to quantify the probability of introduction to those over 700 lakes. That data was instrumental into informing monitoring efforts across the state, and it's continuing to inform prioritization, where to look and where to find Elodia and how to manage it. And it also, the economic data that I showed is also informing and justifying further investments into eradicating the especially and keeping clean the floatplane bases, because that's really the first step to prevent Elodia from being carried into very remote areas from floatplane bases. So it's continuing to inform and justify the action that is now occurring basically on an annual basis, especially in Lake Hood, where the management is focused on very much keeping the lake clean. And so far, Elodia has not been found in Lake Hood. Elodia has also not been found since the eradication of the Kenai lakes. So we do still have a very effective management and management solution in this case, and we're hoping that we're continuing to be very effective by keeping herbicide concentrations in those lakes high to reduce the potential of basically a reestablishment.
Thank you. Jack Dibb asks, he says, I was struck by a seeming contradiction between a couple of early maps that were next to each other. First one showed nearly all of Alaska to be considered pristine wilderness. The next one showed locations where 300 invasive species have been found in Alaska that look to cover more than half the state. Are the invasive not a sign of some degradation? And as a follow-up to Allison, logging equipment could also be an important vector. But the question, do you see that question in the staff in the chat?
Should I go back to that slide? Was that an early slide that showed the Alaska invasive species clearinghouse data?
Yes, good idea.
Yeah, that may be a little bit misleading. I should these slides here.
Oh, you need to share your screen. We're not seeing your screen yet.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. Probably these two slides. This one.
I believe that's what he's talking about. This one,
yeah,
and
so
then the next one. Yeah.
So this is obviously a very crude measure, and Watson has certainly applied a different methodology here. It's just looking at it's just pointing out that you know, as a whole, these are pristine ecosystems. Yet, what I don't think in the definition that Watson uses, this data is showing up. I mean, if you have an invader coming into, you know, what Watson calls a pristine landscape, you know, one could argue that it's no longer pristine, right? But I think what Watson was pointing out was that these ecosystems are still functioning in a largely functioning largely as, you know, ecosystems that have been less altered by humans, and we are in that process of altering them by, you know, carrying invasive species across Alaska. This is just a start. In these maps here, these polygons, obviously, this polygon is kind of a zoomed out level. It's I would say in this case it's probably not a good way to illustrate this, as when you zoom into these polygons, it can be just basically a dot on the landscape rather than encompassing the area of that infestation. So in this case, I have to kind of qualify this illustration here as kind of a very zoomed out level, and it's not. It doesn't show that each polygon is the size of the infestation, so it's misleading. I acknowledge that. Did that make the did that clarify that that issue or that question?
I think Jack will probably respond. And while we're waiting for that, Aaron Martin asks, many of the points in the Alaska EPIC database are also very isolated to the roadways and communities and have not spread out across the open spaces yet.
Yeah.
And Theo Grabber asks, good point, Allison, also with the infrastructure money and the coming boom in infrastructure projects in rural Alaska, construction activities are going to be a major vector in the future. Also, this boom will bring increased plane traffic for engineering and environmental reviews and surveys prior to all these projects. And then Allison follows up by saying, Toby, if you can share a contact at AKICIP, who works on the economics of terrestrial invasive plants and or equipment vectors, that would be great. Do you want to respond to any of this? And then Jack also responded and said, yes, the graphics on the slide make it look worse than reality.
Right.
Did you want to respond to any of those comments, Toby?
On the construction equipment?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's an obvious pathway, and one that we should, I think, is very important to acknowledge and to plan for. And this may be certainly a case where we could. It would be good to have more research on that now in order to be ready and inform decisions as these larger projects and infrastructure development projects are getting on the way. But again, we in Alaska, there are regulations in place that that prevents some of that, but we should take a look at those again and make sure that we do the prevention that's really necessary to keep the pathway risk low.
Thanks. And then Allison asked if you could share a contact except who works on the economics of terrestrial invasive plants.
I don't know if anybody, but
okay.
I could certainly talk to her, and if she shoots me an email, we can go from there.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I don't see any people raising their hands unless I'm missing something. I had one more question myself about the Elodia, and I'm wondering, does it displace native, does it also, you talked about the habitat that it impacts. Does it also displace native key species on which the salmon rely?
Yeah, it's creating really dense mats of vegetation that are denser than the native vegetation, and it's certainly pushing. It's been shown in the literature that anywhere where it is invasive, it is affecting kind of the diversity of other aquatic native plants and really encroaching on the habitat of those. And it's structurally a very different habitat, which makes it quite different. And yeah, really, I'm not an aquatic biologist by any means, but from what I read in the literature, that's been an issue all across the globe where you have Elodia invade aquatic systems, that it's pushing out the natives, and it's creating a much more dense vegetative environment.
Thank you. Jack Dibb asks or says there has been a lot of press about beavers moving north and increasing permafrost thaw and generally changing hydrology. Do folks in Alaska consider them to be an invasive species or just an native expanding range?
This is in specifically what species?
Beavers. Oh,
beavers.
Yeah, so it's terrestrial, but terrestrial and river.
No, I mean, should go back to the definition of an invasive species, which is a non-native species that's really causing harm to not only the ecology and the environment, but really also economic harm across the landscape. And I wouldn't consider it an invasive species, beaver, because they are native to Alaska.
Oh, that's interesting. There's a comment from Theo Graber saying they cause harm, but so I'm curious, they're native to Alaska as a whole, but that one map you showed that divided Alaska into many different zones might argue that isn't they're invading from one zone to another, but it's still Alaska. Is there any argument for them being invasive in that kind of context?
To invade, I'm not quite understanding that.
From one ecosystem to another within Alaska.
I wouldn't call that invasive.
Okay, thanks. And then there's discussion
but
about.
I think so. Let me point out a few things here. I think one aspect we certainly need to grapple with, probably across how we should manage manage ecosystems across Alaska or the Arctic, so to speak, in a climate change induced environment. And climate change, being one driver, and human-induced movements and other things being another driver, we are going to live in kind of a novel in novel assemblages, and we may or may not prevent many of these outcomes. And I think what we got to focus on is the outcomes that we can really prevent, where we have proven management applications and where it seems to be very obvious, like in the example I showed you on mussels. It seems very effective. It has been effective in other areas, and these are the kind of management applications we can put in place. But we are going to be living in a new kind of world with new assemblages that are partly going to be novel. And then another question is, how are we going to really take advantage of it? And I think the climate opportunities are quite large. And maybe the invasive species management of the new world is not going to be the same as it is of the old world. But I think as long as we can really pick these low-hanging fruits and prevent some really bad ones coming in, we should certainly, I think we should do it. Because it's the economic sense. It makes economic sense.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any further questions. So I think we're ready to close. On behalf of Alaska, I want to thank you, Toby, for joining. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and especially Toby for a really great presentation. Again, today's webinar will be archived and available on the ARCIS seminar series to view later on. You can visit the ARCIS homepage for more information about ARCIS, our programs, and upcoming Arctic-related events at www.arcis.org. We are continually working to improve our seminar series, as well as looking for suggestions for future seminar topics and speakers. Please take a minute or two to complete our short survey. A link to that is available now in the chat window. The survey link will be provided also in the follow-up email that you receive once the seminar has been posted to our archive. Thank you again to Toby Schwoerer, as well as to all of you for joining us. This concludes our webinar. Be well. Oh, I'm sorry, I needed to get back and say that the ARCIS seminar series will be taking a break during the summer, June, July, and August, but we will return in September with Carolina Behe with the Inuit Circumpolar Council of Alaska, and she will speak on ethical and equitable engagements for protocols. So with that, I wish you all well for the summer, and we will see you again in September. Keep in touch and be well. Thank you.